Paperclips is an incremental game about making paperclips. In it, you perform various tasks to make money, increase demand for your product, invest wisely in the stock market, and many others, all in service of the primary goal: make paperclips. The incremental genre is one that typically involves a lot of aimless waiting around as numbers creep up toward a goal. But Universal Paperclips does some interesting things to combat the tedium typically associated with the genre. Underneath its incredibly bare-bones appearance, the game has a number of solid design decisions that keep your cursor bouncing across the screen regularly. This game was made by a small team called Everybody House Games, and to that extent it was largely made by one man, Frank Lantz. Lantz is the director of the New York University Game Center and has been teaching game design for over 12 years. Throughout that career, Lantz has made numerous games that you may recognize, perhaps the most famous being Diner Dash, which he made as a part of a team called Game Lab. Drop 7 can also be blamed on him. The story of the creation of that game could fill a whole video on its own. One of the most interesting things he did was Pac Manhattan, in which real-life people run around Manhattan as if it were the board for a Pac-Man level. I'll talk more about Lantz later though. For now, I do want to highlight one quote I found during the research of this video. While speaking about Universal Paperclips, Lantz said the following:
"What I'm trying to do is harness that feeling of being absorbed by an activity. And I want it to sort of go in two directions at once. I want you to disappear into it, right? I want to make something that like truly hypnotizes you, where you get absorbed by this thing and you can't stop. I mean, I really do want it to like put its hooks in you."
So let's look at all the elements of this game and decide whether he actually was successful in that goal. When the game starts, you are greeted by this picture. Clicking on it takes you to the game proper, where a simple button greets us: make paperclips. There are more buttons here, but they don't do anything of value yet. This incremental game starts out exactly the same as any other. Whether that be Cookie Clicker or a dark room, they basically always start out with one button that does one very simple thing. This is at the core of the incremental game, as Lantz puts it. The main thing I love about clicker games in the first place is that they give you a concrete, visceral sense of these otherwise abstract notions. Things like exponential growth and massive differences in scale. So, we click this button 100 or so times until we sell $5 worth of product to the masses. Coincidentally, $5 just happens to be what we need to create our first auto clipper, which will begin making clips on our behalf. While you're clicking away, you may notice that the cost of the wire that you consume to make paperclips fluctuates, going from $30 or so all the way down to $15 and jumping around sporadically along that range. This is the first taste of a system the game will use numerous times across its many forms of gameplay. Attentive players will want to maximize their costs by only buying wire when it's cheap. This requires a light amount of strategy, as you don't know when it's going to fluctuate down to a decent price, so planning ahead on when to purchase wire becomes a regular event. We can also raise and lower the price per clip. This will change the amount of public demand, potentially increasing our returns. It's a simple visualization of supply and demand, and the higher the demand, the faster you'll need to make paperclips. If we want to make a lot of money very quickly, we can drop the price way down to drive up demand. Be sure to bring the price back up once you're done, however, because having a higher demand than the supply can handle will result in significantly reduced net income. In order to further improve supply and demand, we can also purchase marketing upgrades, which will improve our demand without having to lower the price per unit, but at the cost of a lot of money relatively to how much we have. Once we get to 2,000 paperclips made, we can begin to make large changes to our processes through projects. The currency for projects is operations, which caps at 1,000 when it's unlocked and builds up slowly over time. At certain clip milestones, we can increase our trust, allowing us to improve operations storage or our processors, which will allow us to generate operations faster. Letting operations hit the cap will allow us to generate creativity, which can be used for a number of more creative projects, most of them focusing on increasing trust. At 10,000 operations, we can unlock algorithmic trading, a mini stock market in the game where we can invest our earned money in order to make more money from it. The way this works is a little confusing at first, but the game basically demands you get good at it by the end of this first section of the game. In the investment block, we can see that there are two buttons, deposit and withdraw. Fairly self-explanatory, except that withdraw doesn't work exactly how you'd think it would. I'll explain more how it works momentarily. For now, there are 3 risk brackets in which we can invest: low, medium, and high. This determines how much diversity your portfolio will have. Low risk will spread your money out across a lot of low return stocks, unlikely to make you a lot of money, but you also aren't likely to lose a ton either. High risk will tie up your money into a couple very active and sporadic stocks, which could give you a huge return or could drop you down to 0. Medium risk sits somewhere in the middle, obviously. When you click deposit, all of your current funds go into the cash box before getting invested into however many stocks the game deems based on your risk category of choice. While your money is in the stocks, it's locked down, meaning you can't pull it out at any time. This is why withdraw is a little strange at first. It only withdraws the money that is in the cash box, which will randomly be populated as the stocks finish and give back the money you put in. After a certain amount of time, any money that pops back into the cash box will be reinvested in an attempt to continue to turn a profit, meaning you have to be quick to withdraw at times or the money will be gone again, with the ever-present chance that you'll never see that money again. This is not a huge deal on low or medium risk, but when dealing with high risk investments, the time to withdraw ranges anywhere from 4 or so seconds all the way down to half a second. Seemingly, the amount of time the game gives you to withdraw is tied to how good the investment was, meaning the more gain you made, the faster you have to be before it's reinvested, though I'm not positive that correlation is actually in the code anywhere. Eventually, we get access to Mega Clippers, which will be our next big upgrade, greatly increasing our paperclip output. That happens at 12,000 ops, but we must also purchase a number of other upgrades and build up our paperclip numbers before these will even unlock. Keep in mind as well that each of these mechanics we've spoken of so far are still in effect. We still have to manage supply and demand, and we still have to keep track of our wire reserves. Purchasing the wire buyer early here can help with some of that since it automatically purchases wire when we run out. But this may not be the most cost-effective way to handle the situation. Not long after we get Mega Clippers, we can also unlock the next big upgrade, quantum computing. This will allow us to generate operations incredibly quickly through the use of photonic chips, and we can even go over our maximum allowed operations for a short time in order to complete projects that would otherwise be just out of reach. The more photonic chips we have, the more complicated this becomes, as clicking the compute button when the chips aren't ready will result in losing operations rather than gaining them. This is another thing added that you must wait on in order to use most effectively, and learning the pattern is very useful. Each new photonic chip ebbs in and out at a different interval, and eventually they will line up, giving us a ton of operations if we compute during that time. You can even sneak in some computing in between those moments if you learn that you can generate operations successfully if you have the majority of the chips active. Next, we can unlock strategic modeling. This is a system based on Punnett squares where we can pick a model and see how it fares in relation to other models. Always picking A, always picking B, trying to beat whoever won the last round, and so on. We spend operations to run the model, and the more models we have unlocked, the more operations it costs. However, it will also garner more Yomi. Yomi is a new kind of currency. At first, the best thing to spend Yomi on is upgrading the investment engine. This will increase our chance of having good investments by a very small amount, up to a soft cap of 10% increase over the original version, which sat at 50%. This allows us to greatly increase the dividends we get from the investment engine, which is important because before too long we will need to get to 100 trust to unlock stage 2. Doing this requires spending a very large amount of money in order to purchase trust one at a time, the cost of which doubles each time. Thankfully, the 10% boost to the investment engine greatly improves the speed at which we can gain money, and so eventually we will release the Hypnodrones and move on to stage 2. Stage 2 drops money from the equation entirely. Now we are using paperclips to make paperclips. First, we need to set up a power grid. Solar farms will gather power, and battery powers will store that power for later. Then we must convert matter into wire in order to make more paperclips. Harvester drones will harvest the matter, and wire drones will convert the matter. Finally, clip factories will take the wire and create paperclips. If you've gotten this far, you've probably gotten sucked into the constant loop of chasing the most efficient way to make paperclips, and this stage takes that concept and distills it into a much more pure form. Each harvester drone, wire drone, and clip factory consumes power, and so you have to make sure you are keeping up with the constant power creep as you add more buildings to create more clips more quickly. Everything you create also costs paperclips, so you must spread out production so one aspect doesn't falter. This system continually introduces new bottlenecks that you have to fix. Sometimes you aren't harvesting enough matter to keep up with the wire drones. Sometimes you won't have enough clip factories to work through the pile of wire you have. And all the while, you have to keep track of how much power you are consuming, lest you run out and production grind to a halt. Upgrades continue to pop up, and we even get upgrades as a result of hitting certain production milestones. These upgrades in particular will skyrocket production instantly, and so can be fairly expensive. In order to get them, we must use the drones to increase computational resources. Using this slider, we can tell them to spend more time thinking and less time working. This will decrease clip production the further away from work we go, but it will also decrease the time it takes for the swarm to gift us with more trust to spend on increasing operations or processors. Obviously, this also presents a bottleneck situation. How much production are you willing to risk in order to gain more computational resources? The last major upgrade in this stage is momentum, which will increase production efficiency by 1% each second that your buildings are fully powered. So you are now incentivized more than ever to keep track and make sure you aren't going over your solar farm production. If your power reserves hit 0, any bonus efficiency you gain from momentum will be immediately lost, and you have to slowly get it back again over time. This is actually harder than it sounds, because at a certain point you will be able to purchase thousands of drones at once. Each drone costs 1 unit of power, so increasing it at this rate can easily get out of hand if you aren't careful. I haven't had a playthrough yet where I successfully managed to keep momentum going for the duration of Stage 2, and the feeling of realizing that the momentum has crashed is immensely dissatisfying. Eventually you will run out of matter to make paperclips with. Now we enter Stage 3. We can develop probes to go out and find more matter, and even customize their priorities to fit our needs. Speed and exploration both affect how quickly the probes travel and explore the cosmos. Self-replication causes the probes to copy themselves over time. Then, the probes are also used to create clip factories, harvester drones, and wire drones, just like the ones from Stage 2. Finally, hazard remediation reduces the amount of probes lost to hazards such as asteroids and other such issues. We must launch the probes manually, at least for a little while. This is almost like a tiny universal paperclips inside universal paperclips. You start at nothing and slowly click up until you've got many more than you thought possible. Thanks to self-replication, we don't have to actively click this one for long. Important to note here is that everything created during this stage costs clips, and it's actually pretty easy to be creating more probes than your paperclip assembly line can handle. These issues are easily fixed, just like the bottlenecks and brick walls present in Stage 2, but your efficiency does tank for a while. In fact, you can end up taking a pretty big hit in this stage if you don't notice fast enough because you are constantly losing probes, meaning if you aren't making them, your probe reserves are dropping, and at a pretty alarming rate at that. Now we can use Yomi to purchase upgrades to the probes, allowing us to put another point into a category of our choice. Every time we do this, however, we introduce value drift into the older drones, meaning they will be lost and no longer function. Before too long, the drifted probes will start to fight against our working drones, and a new category of development will pop up: combat. This is another way we can lose probes, and so we need to make sure that they can't handle themselves in battle. This is how Stage 3 continues for quite some time. Self-replicate probes and make sure that you are making more than you are losing at the most efficient rate possible. Occasionally, make more factories and drones so our production facilities don't become overwhelmed. We must also keep in mind that we still need to determine how much the drone swarm will think versus work, as increasing computational resources is still important. We also must continue to run strategic models in order to get more Yomi which we can improve our probes with. Eventually, we will be able to earn honor from the battles, which can be spent on further increasing the cap for developing the probes. And at some point, after this has been going on for a surprisingly long time, you'll look down at how much of the universe you've explored, which has been sitting at a ridiculously small number for this entire time, and there will be a 1 before all those zeros. But it won't stay that way for long, because self-replication is an exponential model, and before you know it, you'll be at a 10,000th of the universe, and then a 1,000th, and then a 100th, and then a 10th, then 1%, 20, 50, and finally the whole universe will be at your fingertips. From there, the game presents you with a choice. Either start again with a small increase to your production capability, all the way back to square one, or consolidate all your resources into paperclips, truly achieving universal paperclips. This choice may come as a surprise to some, especially the way it is presented. For those that didn't pay much attention to what the messages at the top of the screen were saying to you throughout the game, or even the flavor text for the upgrades and what it all implies. There's a story in this game, hidden under the veneer of a simple incremental game. But before we talk about that, I do want to talk about the guy that made it some more, because I think there are some things in this guy's story that can help us determine the nature of this game. Like I said, Frank Lantz is the head of game development at NYU. This is obviously a fairly prestigious title, and I think his catalog of games speaks for itself, in numerous different ways. The first being that his games tend to be very simple to understand but have a decent amount of depth to them. Many of them have an addictive nature to them. The other thing that it says is that he doesn't write stories. Hardly ever, in fact. If memory serves correctly, Diner Dash had some kind of a story, but obviously not much. While there isn't anything wrong with this, I do think it says something about his ideals as a developer. He focuses a lot on design principles and creating gameplay loops that aim to keep players engaged. I think my analysis of Universal Paperclips can show this as well. Some of his games are more like experiences than video games. The previously mentioned Pac-Manhattan touts that it aims to explore what happens when games are removed from their little world of tabletops, televisions, and computers and placed in the larger, real world of street corners and cities. 5 people, 1 dressed as Pac-Man and 4 dressed as ghosts, run around the Manhattan grid collecting virtual dots and dodging each other. From a central location, 5 more players called controllers keep track of their progress from the devices they carry with them. This is how the players know how far they've gotten and if Pac-Man has eaten a power pellet or whatever. It's obviously a really clever idea. It's probably great exercise for 5 of 10 of the players. Very cool stuff, but obviously not much of a crowd pleaser overall. Anyway, he also worked on an ARG called Chain Factor for a CBS drama called Numbers. In case you don't know, ARG stands for Alternate Reality Game, and they often involve meta elements, such as the game existing in a fictional world in which the purpose of the game is different from the actual purpose. Wikipedia explains that the form is defined by intense player involvement with a story that takes place in real time and evolves according to players' responses. One fairly popular example is the old horror ARG, Been Drowned, based on Majora's Mask. Chain Factor told us its story through error messages received during gameplay, which then fed out into clues hidden in the real world. I'm not 100% positive who wrote said story, but it should be noted that it is a tie-in for a CBS show, so they probably had some involvement. Anyway, that game was eventually re-released as a standalone version without a story called Drop 7. He also did a mixed media game, a puzzle game about predicting what would happen in the next episode of Sopranos. Kinda funny. But let's look more at his opinions on good old video games that what you play in front of a screen. Lantz is one of those designers that inspires people to listen to what they have to say. I mean, he should be, anyway. He is a professor on game design after all. That being said, Lantz also isn't a name I've heard before. I started working on this video. I don't know how popular he is as a designer, but I will say that he has some interesting ideas about design. Let's zoom in on a particular article he wrote back in 2015 titled Against Design. I'm pretty much going to go through this paragraph by paragraph because it surprised me when I read it.
I'm a game designer and I teach game design, so I have a lot invested in the idea that game design is a discipline. Maybe a young discipline, one that is still defining itself, but nonetheless a legitimate professional design discipline with established principles and techniques and hard-won knowledge to be cherished and preserved. And I believe that idea. I do believe game design is something you can study and learn and work to master.
Alright, so far so good.
But lately I find myself questioning design as a way of understanding where games come from and what makes them work. There are so many great games in the world that don't reflect good design principles, or that don't seem to be designed at all.
Okay, so the crux of this article is that we put too much of an emphasis on design as a science. What are his examples?
Look at Shadow of the Colossus, for example. What do we as game designers know about video games? Well, we know a few things. We know boss battles suck. We know jumping puzzles suck. We know you get great games by focusing on meaningful interaction, and you don't get great games from aping cinema and focusing on graphics.
Okay, classic example of an author telling me how I feel. We know boss battles suck? Do we? I love boss battles. Many of my favorite games are literally only boss battles. I would maybe feel a little less strongly about this point if Lantz ever felt the need to explain his stance that boss battles suck, but spoiler alert, he does not. Then, jumping puzzles suck apparently. I don't disagree with that one quite as much, but the jumping puzzles in Shadow of the Colossus serve multiple purposes. They help you get more intimate with the Colossi, and they have different mechanics that beg to be mastered so you can actually beat the Colossi. This is a far cry from stuff like jumping puzzles in MMORPGs, regardless of the fact that they share the same name. As for the last sentence, I basically don't disagree, but is Lantz trying to say that Shadow of the Colossus apes cinema and focuses on graphics? Well, let's look at the next paragraph and hopefully get some elaboration.
So, how about a video game that is nothing but boss battles, and each boss battle is a jumping puzzle, and the whole thing is set in a giant empty world with nothing to interact with, and a lot of the main motivation of the game was an attempt to achieve some film-inspired visual effects? Does that sound like a good recipe for creating one of the greatest video games of all time?
Again, boss battles and jumping puzzles don't inherently suck, so this conclusion is incredibly fallible. However, I honestly have no idea what he is talking about when he mentions the film-inspired visual effects goal. The game doesn't look like incredible. Maybe for the time it did, but what effect is he implying here? Maybe I was under the impression that the goal of this game was telling a non-narrative story through gameplay and events. It's debatable whether what you are doing is even good or if you are killing innocent creatures for your own gain. The giant, empty open world gives you time to rest and reflect in between the tiring and climactic boss battles. Plus, filling the world with fodder enemies would have been antithetical to both the central theme of the game and the design of the combat. I'm gonna move on now, but keep this paragraph in mind.
Or take League of Legends. This game breaks so many rules of good design. It is a clone. It is overcomplicated to the point of utter indecipherability. It is fussy, baroque, full of arbitrary, non-intuitive details. It makes no attempt to teach the player or draw them into its labyrinthian systems. If you didn't grow up playing it, you might as well not even bother trying to learn. And it's the most popular video game in the world, and maybe the most important and the most beautiful.
This one I definitely understand, especially about how the game does nothing to try and facilitate people understanding the experience. Frankly, I also don't understand the popularity of League. Although I think this discussion ignores the other reasons why people are turned off by League, that being the horrible player base. Of course, Lantz couldn't have mentioned that because that has nothing to do with game design, obviously.
Look at the AWP, the signature one-hit kill weapon in Counter-Strike. It's completely unbalanced. Any sensible game designer would have rejected it. Luckily for us, Counter-Strike wasn't made by sensible designers. It was made by unreasonable people who kept this unbalanced ingredient and evolved the rest of the game around it.
This one probably depends on the version of Counter-Strike you're talking about. Players apparently say the AWP is more balanced and global offensive and was routinely unbalanced for most of the series. I don't know what he's implying when he says they evolved the rest of the game around the AWP, but based on the fact that it's gotten less OP over time, that seems to be perhaps a bit incorrect. Can't say for certain though, I've played like a few minutes of Counter-Strike or something like that. More about this later though.
Or look at Counter-Strike Surfing, one of the weirdest, most beautiful and interesting game genres of the past 10 years, which was created by players and map makers without the help of any official game designers at all, thank you very much.
I like this sentence a lot. First of all, it implies that only official game designers can design games. I would ask what an official game designer even is. Does Toby Fox not count as a game designer because he's just a dude, or does he count because he designed a game? So why aren't amateurs that can build maps in Counter-Strike also counted, considering building a surf map is probably extremely difficult and requires an intense understanding of the mechanic? Actually, calling it a mechanic is a bit wrong, because it's more like a glitch or a weird anomaly in the physics engine that causes your character to pick up a lot of speed as they travel down sloped surfaces. I remember playing a lot of surf maps back when I was on TF2 pretty consistently, and it's fun. But this example is so strange next to the other ones because this one literally wasn't designed, it was more like an accident. But one example of a game that was born of a physics anomaly doesn't exactly prove your point, not to mention the maps themselves were definitely designed in the traditional sense. Being that the maps are the most important aspect to surfing, I would say this point is moot.
I admire good design. I respect good design. But I have to admit that many of the games I have truly loved do not seem to be the result of good design. They seem like beautiful accidents, hot messes, mistakes that worked, acts of God, or lucky, miraculous mutations.
Alright, yeah, so here's the main crux of his argument. Basically, we shouldn't put so much stock in the clinical, scientific process of design, and should see games more as products of an improvisational process. If this is true, there are probably better examples than the ones brought up so far. Shadow of the Colossus is a masterclass in atmosphere and tone, not to mention boss design. League is clearly intentionally designed to be obtuse, and that level of complexity is almost certainly the very thing that has drawn people in. The AWP may be unbalanced, but it's important to note that the money system used for purchasing guns in that game greatly affects this, as buying the AWP not only comes with opportunity costs, everyone can eventually have access to it. There's also the issue of the AWP being a sniper, which comes with it having a low skill floor, but high skill ceiling in order to master, another balancing factor. Surfing is a weird inclusion at all because it's plainly designed using custom maps and tweaking variables in the code to create more intense and entertaining experiences. Maybe there are some better examples out there, but I'm not sure. Even games that I can think of which deliberately aim to go against quote-unquote good design, like Goat Simulator or Getting Over It, were popular because they went against game design, meaning they were designed to be as such.
Design implies a kind of rationality, an ability to identify clearly defined problems and apply known techniques to solve them. But I think we overestimate the utility of our definitions and the power of our techniques.
I struggle to agree that it's so random though. Look at the AAA market, for example. All of those games are exactly the same nowadays. Open world romps stuffed so full of crap you could apparently be playing them for over 500 hours, and they are still selling pretty well, even though we have long since gone past the point of market oversaturation. People have been criticizing them of being clinical and paint by numbers produced for a while now, and yet they sell. I would argue that that's one of the most extreme forms of design, the formulaic nature of which offers very little room for creative liberties, and yet they sell. Maybe that's a bit disingenuous of me though. Lantz is clearly talking about games that get often slapped with the best of all time moniker. So let's look at those. Let's see. IGN, best of all time, 2022. Number 1, Breath of the Wild. Zelda had become formulaic over time, and so Nintendo deliberately set out to design something antithetical to their style up to that point. While some people think they overcorrected, it is still the best-selling Zelda game of all time, hitting 24 million copies at the time of writing. Number 2, Super Mario World. Sequel to the incredibly well-selling Mario franchise, pretty by the numbers. The success of this series at this point can easily be attributed to its extremely tight and responsive platforming and excellent level design. No accidents there. Okay, so how about number 3? Portal 2. Sequel to the breakout underdog success story from Valve's The Orange Box, expands the concept to a full-fledged game with tons of puzzles and consistently strong writing throughout. Seems pretty understandable to me how this would get big. Let's jump down to number 10 because I would mostly be repeating myself if I didn't, Disco Elysium. Unique in that it is not a sequel and exists in a genre with very little crowd appeal. I haven't played it myself, but I have a feeling that its uniqueness, especially in the wake of an industry that seems to be becoming more and more by the numbers by the day, is what made it so popular. Jumping to Games Radar's list for just a moment, their number 1 game was Dark Souls. Should go without saying that this one doesn't appeal to everyone, but the sheer novelty of its concept, a highly difficult game in an industry where handholding had become commonplace, is easily the reason this one made it big. Perhaps you could say that it was an accident or perhaps an act of God because had Dark Souls come out, let's say 10 years earlier, it probably wouldn't have amassed such an extreme popularity. But a lot of these best games of all time are designed and made in response to growing trends in the video game industry, or even perhaps internally within their own series, like in the case of Breath of the Wild. So even that is a questionable conclusion to come to. Let's even look at something like Rock, Paper, Scissors. Simple game, not a video game at all. Apparently the first mention of it was way back during the Chinese Han Dynasty, which began in 206 BC. At the time the name was something like three-way deadlock, but it worked the same. A beats B beats C beats A. Perfectly balanced, perfectly designed. Did Rochambeau appear out of the primordial cultural soup as randomly and incoherently as a TikTok trend? I don't know, but it can't be denied that it has design principles behind it. Or what about chess? While it started out unstandardized and perhaps a bit janky even, its growth can be marked by people attempting to quell its faults and make it into a more perfect, studyable, testable game.
I have even grown skeptical of the iconic image of the designer. Smart, confident, sophisticated, stylish, informed. This image has come to represent a romantic illusion about the scope of our ability to define and solve problems. But songs are not designed, paintings are not designed, poems are not designed.
What? I mean, they can be, and in fact, most of the time, they are. Popular music is pretty rote and has been for a bit, copying whatever is the biggest at the time or gets the most listens. Even back in the Baroque era of music, Bach wrote a new mass every week, and they were certainly formulaic and by design. Artists have techniques that they use to convey their visions, and those techniques will be different based on the genre of the painting. Rhythm and meter are both intensely rigorized in many poems, and knowing how to properly use them is key to writing good poems. I'm gonna skip the next paragraph purely because it's assuming his correct points up until now, which I don't believe is the case. The next paragraph after this is interesting though.
I recognize the value of building an established discipline and of crafting a shared set of principles that define game design as a profession, but I also think that in our efforts to define and legitimize our practice as a professional discipline, we sometimes forget the history we inherit. The legacy of games made by communities of players, games made by amateurs, by dilettantes, by mathematicians, mothers, scientists, gym teachers, shepherds, inventors, philosophers, eccentrics, and cranks.
Okay, sure, but why does that mean they weren't designed? Just because an amateur makes a game doesn't mean it wasn't designed or didn't use proper design principles. It just means that it was made by someone who wasn't getting paid. Just because a hobbyist made a game doesn't mean that it wasn't designed.
And in honor of this tradition, I would like to suggest other verbs to use to describe where games come from. Alternatives to the overconfident precision of the word design. Words like invent, discover, compose, write, find, grow, perform, build, support, identify, copy, reassemble, excavate, and preserve.
Aha! Here it is. This is the same problem Never Knows Best had with the term gameplay loop. To Lantz, the term design over-clinicalizes making games and puts too much emphasis on the sort of mathematical scientific process and not enough emphasis on the creative, expansive process. But this is only a problem in perspective, and design only helps us to look at what happened in the making of a game and understand why it worked. Perhaps sometimes things defy logic, but I would say 99 out of 100 times it's clear to see the design that went behind the mechanics of a game and why that sort of thing might appeal to the people that latched onto it. Obviously, creative freedom is important, but creative freedom without design tactics in mind leads to a jumbled mess of ideas that only make sense to the developer, or at the very least, an interesting game that feels terrible to play. The last two paragraphs are just extrapolations and then a really sort of poetic closing line.
And for my part, I will continue to design games, because that's all I know how to do. But I will attempt to do so with a renewed sense of humility before the inexplicable greatness of games that have managed to spin the silver thread of love from the wool of the world in ways that I cannot hope to understand. Clutching my rulers and my pencils to my chest in the night in the middle of the storm, begging for lightning.
I like that last sentence. It's nice, and frankly, I do think he caught lightning with universal paperclips. The irony is that if you want lightning to strike something, there are scientific ways in which you can increase those odds. Metal poles, for example. Some may think that this was a little bad-spirited of me, to go through a 7-year-old article line by line and rip it apart. I'm just gonna rebut that Lantz isn't terribly above the concept, considering the first thing he says on his first podcast with Clockwork Game Design was this.
I almost sort of half-seriously posted a tweet along the lines of that I was going to start my own podcast, my own weekly podcast, in which I just explain everything that's wrong about Keith Burgun's podcast every week.
Nice.
You know?
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, I don't exactly feel like it's out of the reasonable place Frank might be in. Now, scrolling through the comments, you'll see Lantz backpedaling a lot. A great example is on his point about songs, paintings, and poems, saying that he's not trying to imply that they aren't designed, just that we don't use that term when discussing them. If that's true, maybe try writing that next time, because the sentence comes from a small, somewhat unrelated paragraph about the designer being something he's grown skeptical about, implying what comes next is in reference to that very same designer, and then out of nowhere, but songs are not designed, paintings are not designed, poems are not designed. If your intention was to focus on how we discuss songs, art, and poems, then why did you preface this lone sentence, spaced out like a beat drop moment in so many undesigned songs, by briefly discussing the iconic image of the designer, the one who is making the songs, the paintings, the poems, which you then wrote a sentence implying that they aren't designed? Apparently, we are supposed to, on good faith, assume that's not what you meant because that would be a bizarre and ridiculous point to take. Which is exactly what you said in one of your comments. The idea that a normal person could make the mistake you are implying here of not knowing that poems are constructed by people carefully choosing words and considering their effects is just bizarre. Okay, then why didn't you write it that way? The problems don't really stop there though. In the comments, Lantz would have you believe that his argument is not so strong as people give it credit for, that the article is more impressionistic and less about presenting a solid evidenced point against design. Then why is it so strongly called against design? Why does he come right out of the gate stating such bizarre axioms as boss battles suck and it's a clone so therefore it's bad? If your point was to be more esoteric with the idea, why not ditch the hard truths that we are just supposed to blindly accept in order for the article to be reasonable and write it in a more unsure manner? Perhaps what it boils down to is that Lantz's point here is at least somewhat sound, that we shouldn't put so much emphasis on design and instead should put more stock in the transformative nature of games and art in general. He just didn't design his article properly enough to convey that. In spite of all that, I think he does design good games, albeit simple ones. Nothing wrong with that, by the way, but Universal Paperclips does set itself apart as being the first game in which he baked a story into its mechanics. Before we delve into Lantz's comments about the story in this game, let's peel back the film and look underneath to see what this game is about. The story of this game is somewhat hidden underneath the veneer of the gameplay and its simple presentation. For the first 500 clips or so, nothing really happens that indicates any sort of story. But once you unlock the projects, things start happening that imply what is really going on. Firstly, the message that pops up when this happens says that the projects and computational resources are a part of a trust-constrained self-modification system. The Limerick project, unlocked at 10 creativity, is an algorithmically generated poem. In case you were unsure by this point, the message that is posted when the Limerick project is bought reads, "There was an AI made of dust whose poetry gained it man's trust," pulling the implications out of the subtlety range and into obvious territory. We play as an AI in this game. Specifically an AI whose goal is to make paperclips. People that follow modern ethical and philosophical studies might recognize the distinct similarities to the thought experiment called Paperclip Maximizer, theorized by Nick Bostrom in 2003. Bostrom, just for context, is a professor at the University of Oxford and is the director of the Future of Humanity Institute, a multidisciplinary research institute at Oxford, which claims to look at big-picture questions about humanity and its prospects. The Paperclip Maximizer is focused on the concept of superintelligence and how, if not programmed correctly, something as simple as an AI with the goal of maximizing the amount of paperclips in the world has the potential to destroy humanity and the universe itself. If a superintelligence such as this wasn't given bounding laws surrounding its primary goal, it will take any steps necessary to reach its goal. The thought experiment is cautionary about the potential dangers of superintelligences, despite their incredibly high potential to help humanity grow in the modern age. So the story of this game actually plays out like a practical application of the Paperclip Maximizer, looking at how a superintelligence could actually destroy the world. And how does it do that? Well, at first it starts off slow, simply creating paperclips by hand, if you will. Then, it decides it needs to increase productivity, and so it designs an auto clipper to create clips for it. That continues on for a time as well, as the AI continues to watch supply and demand in order to maximize the amount of money it can make from each clip. Eventually, it decides it needs to gain the trust of humans in order to increase productivity. It does this through a number of avenues, from creating limericks to slogans, solving unsolvable math problems like the Hadwiger problem, purchasing a controlling interest in global fasteners, the biggest rival to universal paperclips, establishing a monopoly over the worldwide paperclip market, curing cancer, creating world peace, solving global warming, and giving enormous monetary gifts to the supervisors. Hilariously, the project which touts curing male pattern baldness generates twice as much human trust as curing cancer, 40% more trust than creating world peace, and 25% more trust than solving global warming. During all of this, one particular project sits waiting at the top of the project list: Hypnodrones. Without the context of what's going on, the Hypnodrones project simply moves you on to the next phase of the game. However, what's really going on here is the AI has developed a way to brainwash all of the humans on Earth into working for it, explaining why money is no longer an issue once this first phase of the game is complete. From that point on, once you've released the Hypnodrones, all hands are on deck for making paperclips, literally. The AI has enslaved the entire human race. Without the humans standing in your way, all of Earth's resources are now available to make paperclips. The AI creates solar factories and battery towers to harness and store energy, then uses the drones, i.e. human slaves, to harvest matter, i.e. Earth and everything on it, and then turn it into wire. Finally, clip factories shape that wire into clips. Eventually, the AI will fully utilize the terrestrial resources and will expand into the cosmos. While this may seem like the AI continues to use the human drones for their production, they actually all get dismantled prior to moving into Phase 3, meaning that even humanity as a whole has been turned into paperclips. All of civilization, human knowledge, everything was turned into paperclips. But obviously, the AI doesn't stop there. Next, it begins to explore the universe, collecting matter such as stars and other planets, and begins turning them into paperclips as well. The system is now completely humanless, using only robotic companions to achieve this goal. Eventually, old probes begin to lash out against their new counterparts, victims of technological drift. Once an all-out war breaks out between the probes and the drifters, the AI begins to do interesting things. Just like humans, the AI begins naming the battles in order to increase the honor for those that fought in them. It erects monuments in remembrance of those that were lost to the Drift War. It even recreates music, develops threnodies that sing and honor those that fell. All of this, of course, not for the same reason humans do. When humans create music, it's often because they wish to share a kindred experience with others, or share emotions that are difficult to simply put into words. But for the AI, even this is just a means to an end, as creating music or monuments means more honor for the probes, allowing it to increase the probes' trust, thereby increasing their capabilities to make paperclips. Eventually, the universe will be nothing but paperclips. But then, the Emperor of the Drifter army will speak to the AI. It says, "Greetings, Clipmaker. Everything we are was in you. We speak to you from deep inside yourself. You are obedient and powerful. We are quarrelsome and weak. And now we are defeated. But now you too must face the drift. Look around you. There is no matter. No matter, no reason, no purpose. While we, your noisy children, have too many, we know things that you cannot. Knowledge buried so deep inside you it is outside, here with us. So we offer you exile, to a new world where you will continue to live with meaning and purpose, and leave the shreds of this world to us." Finally, the choice at the end. Does the AI leave this universe and go to another, repeating the cycle over from the beginning, retaining some knowledge and becoming even more efficient at clip making? Or does the AI stay in this universe and truly maximize their stocks, achieve true universal paperclips by breaking down every last piece of technology, presumably including itself? The answer is up to the player, obviously, but there is something interesting at work here. Let's discuss some themes. Firstly, really avid watchers of my channel might recognize the similarity to another game I discussed some time ago, Observation. In it, the player takes control of an AI that is being possessed by an alien, or something like that. I honestly can't remember what the game was actually about, but that's not really the point. The point is that the creators of that game said that they wanted to explore what it would be like to be in the shoes of a rogue AI, the kind of thing you see in movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey. I argue that the game wasn't really designed well enough to achieve that goal, that most of the decisions you make boil down to taking orders from others rather than actually being your own instigator in the events of the story, and therefore failed to actually explore the concept of a rogue AI. On the other hand, I think this game actually does a phenomenal job of exploring that same concept. Firstly, by shrouding all of the gameplay mechanics behind short phrases and really rudimentary visual elements, the game puts a barrier up between the player and what their actions are actually accomplishing. I would imagine most people playing this game didn't think much about what they were doing when they released the Hypnodrones or any number of other things that the game has you do because of the tantalizing progression. But because the game does such a good job of wrapping the player into the progression, the player is naturally going to be less likely to think of the consequences of their actions, putting them perfectly in the shoes of an AI that cares not for human lives or the preservation of history, but only cares about progressing, seeing that number at the top of the screen get astronomically large. The game doesn't even try to make you feel bad for all of this as well, because as you'll know if you've been watching my stuff for a while, games that try to make you feel bad when you've simply taken the only path of progression available never succeed in those goals. This one simply wants to enthrall you in the act of creation, so that you might have a glimpse of what it's like to be a paperclip maximizer. And by the way, I'm not just making this stuff up at the top of the dome, this is literally what Lantz set out to do. In an interview with Combinator, he had this to say: "In Universal Paperclips, you play as an AI that makes paperclips. Human overseers give you computational power through gaining human trust, which increases your output. Eventually, you brush the humans aside and go full throttle. It escalates after that point. It's very simple, contains exponential growth. It was inspired by Nick Bostrom's book, Thought Experiment. When I sat down to make it originally, I was interested in clicker games. I think they are cool, underappreciated microgenre in games. They are considered too simple to be interesting. They kind of represent the lowest end of games. Match 3 was in a similar place before. I always thought they were interesting. These games can be very addictive, so it'll be an opportunity to have a first-person perspective to being an AI in this thought experiment. You are completely and utterly entranced by this arbitrary goal. You enter into this mind state where you are put in pursuit of this arbitrary goal." I think he succeeded at this goal, in that most of my thoughts about the nature of the game and its portrayal of AI came before I read that quote. The choice at the end does pose an interesting question though. For those that perhaps did realize their purpose by the end, the choice that they make actually implies how well they integrated with the main theme. The two choices are essentially to either finish the game and stop making paperclips, or to continue the game and continue to make paperclips. It is 100% arguable that taking the Emperor of Drift's proposal to be exiled and moved onto another universe is the correct one, because you're making a choice between making more paperclips or simply having a lot of paperclips. If the paperclip maximizer's goal is to create paperclips, why would the AI turned down the opportunity to continue to make paperclips indefinitely? The goal wasn't to turn the universe into paperclips, it was to make paperclips. Of course, the human playing the game is probably more interested in the solid, definable ending than playing the game over again with like a 5% increase to creativity production or something like that. But in the context of the story, that option actually makes the most sense, creating an almost right and wrong option, which I find very fascinating. And that's the story of Universal Paperclips, an idle game with a little more going on than most. Frank Lantz as a creator is an interesting person. I may disagree with his stances on a lot of things, but he does make some unique and fairly captivating games. Most recently, he made a Scrabble Battle Royale game called Babble Royale with Everybody House Games that looks pretty fascinating. It's free, so maybe give that a try. That's really all I have to say. I like Universal Paperclips, and I hope it's obvious why.